Welcome everyone to What the Ref, your favourite podcast about everything Research Excellence Framework. My name is Ola.
I'm Simon.
And I'm James. And this week we've got an interview, like a special, we've had a couple of these before, but we've got an interview with Gareth Cole, the Open Research Manager at University of Exeter. But before we get into that, we always do a bit of news. Don't we ask what the ref's been happening this week? Simon, there's not a lot of news, right? But you guys were down in Plymouth. That's news to us.
News on the news front, very quiet, but Plymouth was really interesting. So we were running an NTO workshop, so a not traditionally submitted outputs workshop. This is where we go into the universities and we teach people how to assess not traditionally submitted outputs, or NTOs, as I'm going to say from now on, to prevent me from having to say that phrase over and over again. So we were invited down by Arts University Plymouth, and it was such a fantastic day. And for two major reasons. One thing, it was around arts, the subject in general, and so there was a lot of enthusiasm about sort of coming in and talking about NTOs. And then we were like, we usually in the workshop we're talking about, NTOs are really important, but for this group of people, what we would see as NTOs, or what the ref would see as NTOs, were their entire life. That was by far their most traditional outputs. And the other interesting thing I thought was that they were only made a university 4 years ago, so this is their first ever ref, and they're actually having to gear up to do it. It was absolutely just fascinating seeing the structural issues, the number of committees and things they have to set up. And just we spent a lot of time talking with our hosts there. So Ola, you were there as well. How was it for you?
Yeah, I've been to 3 of them, and I think that's been the most enjoyable one of them all because of how they understood non-traditionally submitted outputs. And, they don't conceptualize them as non-traditionally submitted outputs. One, because they've never submitted anything like this to the ref. And secondly, they're seen as traditional within their own discipline. So it was fantastic to see the enthusiasm around how they can legitimize their work, and questions around is art research, is practice-based art research, or is it something else? So yeah, it was very invigorating, and I really enjoyed that.
And we've not yet to have a full debrief from you guys going down there, but it sounds like there was a really good discussion about portfolios as well, which, as listeners will know, is something we've talked about before, and we're kind of really keen to get more kind of dug into, and about the kind of the place of portfolios within those kind of art institutions and the kind of culture of practice-based research. I don't know if you want to dig into that a little bit more, but I mean, we're certainly going to be picking that thread up over the next, I guess, few months.
That was really interesting. So again, this focus on portfolios, and we've seen it in the arts and humanities disciplines, where portfolios are more important, or at least submitted more frequently than in the other panels. But the thing that really came through for me was when we looked into the outputs and who's submitting NTOs, you see that, we talk about, 2.4% of all outputs are going into NTO categories, but that is being carried significantly by panel D. So we were very much saying that we need to learn from you about how you put these things together. And that really, there was a lot of discussion about portfolios and about actually, there isn't much guidance on how to do it. So people are kind of working it out for themselves. So one of the things we've been discussing with our hosts there was maybe we should get some of the more arts heavy universities together, and we could work on some sort of best practices for how you put a portfolio together, what should go into it, how how many NTOs you should be submitting, and all that sort of stuff. And then we can take that guidance and we can apply it across fields. So from memory, and that's never a good place for me to be, panel D had, I think, 1,300 NTOs submitted to the last ref, and my panel, which is panel B of physical sciences, we had 32. So, there's a massive disparity across there, and there's a lot of learning that could be shared. So one of the things we talked to them about as well was, we said, will you come on the podcast and talk about what it's like setting up for your first ever ref? And they've agreed to do that. So we'll hear more from them in the future.
Fantastic. And I guess we've got a podcast today, Ola, that's very much panel D orientated as well, because it's about books. I mean, it's not only panel D, but, mostly panel D.
Panel C, panel D.
Yeah. Okay. Should we get into it?
Yeah.
Let's go.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to welcome to the What the Ref podcast Gareth Cole, who's the Open Research Manager at University of Exeter. And Gareth's here because him and some colleagues sent over an idea that we might talk about what the ref is happening with books, which is something we talk about quite a lot. I guess it's one of the publication types we consider to be traditional outputs. But as many people in humanities and social sciences know, there's a lot of kind of controversy and change going on around how books relate to the refs. So welcome, Gareth. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, some of the projects you work on, and how you got involved in things like COPIM and Open Book Futures?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on the podcast today. So, so as James said, my name's Gareth Cole, Open Research Manager at the University of Exeter since August 2025. I was previously at Loughborough University, and that's where kind of I started on COPIM and started on Open Book Futures. Way back in the day, I think back in 2008, I finished my PhD in maritime history, and I have actually published a book as well, but not open access. So that might be something to chat about. But yeah, so on COPIM and OBF, so Open Book Futures, and COPIM, if I can remember exactly what it stands for, is Community-Led Open Publication Infrastructures for Monographs. But we call it COPIM for obvious reasons in terms of remembering that. So I've, on both the COPIM project and the Open Book Futures project, I've led or co-led the work package on archiving and preserving open access books. But the COPIM and say the two projects in total, what they've tried to do really is kind of set I was going to say foundations, but it's more than foundations, kind of set the foundations plus and the first level of of kind of the position so that smaller scholar-led presses can participate properly and sustainably and equitably in kind of the publishing ecosystem when it comes to monographs. So the projects have been focused on primarily on open access, smaller open access publishers that are either scholar-led or community-led. And they're really kind of presses that publish maybe no books a year or a book every other year, something like that, or up to about 50 books. So we're not talking massive, large-scale publishing. We're talking kind of that smaller, that I suppose what back in the day might have been seen as niche publishers, but are actually becoming more mainstream as more of them kind of come online, as people understand actually kind of the challenges and kind of the benefits and the advantages of publishing in different ways. Yes, that's kind of a little bit about COPIM, and kind of how I got involved is it's one of those chance meetings over an orange juice, and it genuinely was an orange juice at a conference lunch. So I was actually on a panel with Rupert Gatty, who's one of the co-founders of Open Book Publishers, which is a partner kind of on the project. And we were actually on a panel talking about DOIs for book chapters. And we then just got talking, I say over lunch, around some of the things that we were dealing with in our daily lives and our day-to-day lives. And we both were talking about kind of the preservation and kind of what happens to the stuff that academics produce once it's been published. And Rupert was kind of part of the team that was drafting what became the COPIM bid. I came on board, and 8 to 9 years later, here we are, and here I am. So, it's the benefits of chatting at conferences and events as well, I think, and kind of that networking in person, I think, is kind of how I came on, really.
And that's one of the things I was going to ask you about, actually, because like this is a sort of over a decade's worth of work which people have been putting into this kind of area. So, both of these major projects have to do with openness around books. Some of our listeners might know people like, Robert Gatty, and the work that's been going on with sort of open journals, but books is kind of related, I guess, the two kind of campaigns, the kind of pieces of work on open journals, open books, but there's been a very dedicated piece of work on open books now, which is, would you say, around a decade's worth of like concerted effort in the sector?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we actually had kind of the Future of COPIM conference 2 or 3 weeks ago now. And the two the two PIs, one of, Yannick Adema, who leads COPIM, and Joe DeVille, who leads Open Book Futures, kind of gave the opening keynote. And they kind of showed kind of a meeting back, I think it was in Coventry back in about 2015 or 2016. So before COPIM project started, where the kind of a group of kind of radical OA academics and publishers kind of came together in a seminar room in Coventry, probably 10 people in a room. And then a decade, 11 years later, we're in a lecture theatre. I think it's about 100 people in the room, 150 online. And kind of that growth of interest, that growth of people involved from kind of, I suppose, kind of that scholar-led publisher core, which I think is still kind of at the heart of Copium and Open Book Futures. But then you've got people like me, you've got infrastructure providers, you've got kind of sector organizations like JISC and in the room and things like that. So funders were in the room as well at the conference. So it's, in that decade, it's gone from 10 people in a seminar room in Coventry to 250 people at a conference in London. And I think that really shows kind of the impact of the projects, but also kind of where open access books are now in the kind of the mainstream conversations. We're not just talking about journals. We are talking about books in a way that we weren't, as you said, a decade ago.
And I think the success of Copium, and it's definitely worth celebrating. Loads of people I know from Library World and Open Access World definitely were there. And yet, you said, there is a real success here going from a small seminar room to a big conference. And yet where we are with openness with books is sort of still very complicated, right? Like, clearly, I would say that this is now getting to a point. It's like, if not now, then when? Like, how long can we wait? What are the disadvantages of waiting? Because it seems like we've been asked to wait for openness with books forever.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I think actually, if not now, when? I think now, I mean, what's the phrase? Is it the best time to do something was yesterday? The next best time is today. Genuinely, I think that I think we have to do something now. And actually, I think, to be fair, I think the sector is, speaking from a UK perspective here, I think, and maybe with my day job hat on, but I think the sector is moving. There are conversations. There are discussions amongst librarian groups as to kind of what do we do and how do we do with open access books. But yeah, I think we need to. We need to go now. It's, if we don't go now, then we may well end up, if we don't fix it now or yesterday, we may well end up with the same challenges as we have with journals and kind of the unsustainability of kind of the dominant Western model of publishing when it comes to journals. And we can't have that in books because A, it's not equitable in my opinion, and B, we just don't have the money to do that. So we have to look at kind of a diversity of publishing models. We have to look at what it is that the academy actually wants around open access for books. And to an extent, and I appreciate this is kind of the what the ref conversation, but also I think wider, it's not quite what do we mean by a book, but what open access do we want in the book world? Are we talking about monographs? Are we talking about textbooks? What about creative arts? So novels. What about kind of other forms of kind of that long form publishing,
exhibition catalogs,
edited collections, all of that stuff. And I think actually, yes, we need to go now in terms of kind of that traditional in inverted commas monograph, but I think we need a bigger conversation around the wider, I don't like the phrase long form, but I think it's the one that's used and what a lot of people understand, but kind of that wider long form ecosystem when it comes to open access, because it is, if you move away from monographs, it is different to the journal world. You will have independent researchers, you'll have non-affiliated scholars, you'll have interested amateurs, if I can call them that. And I think that's maybe where it is different to journals. But I say monographs, yeah, we need to move now. Institutions need to stand up. We're beginning to see that with new university presses, kind of other smaller, in inverted commas, publishers being created. So we're getting there. Yeah. What next is and where do we go? That was the future of Copium. That was the conference title, and I think that's the future of Copium could also be the future of open access books. And I think it is. It needs to be a collective conversation.
And it's interesting you mentioned sort of long form in its broadest sense, because that is something that, what Hidden Ref does really care about, because what constitutes long form and what constitutes, a portfolio, and what constitutes these different things are all things we're really thinking about in terms of ref submissions. And I mean, I was at the Morphs launch yesterday, the Materializing Open Research Practices in Humanities and Social Science, if I can remember that acronym correctly, partly run by a colleague here at Southampton, but also involving colleagues you've already mentioned, involved things like Open Book Futures and COPIM. And there's a big piece of work within that funded research, which is also like Hidden Ref, funded by Research England, to kind of look at, well, it's not only funded by Research England, the Morphs project, but there's a big piece of work in there to look at, well, like what forms of openness exist within the kind of the long form space. And I think that's a really, it's a sensible way to be thinking about this, because the problem the ref creates, of course, is that it likes putting things in boxes, which is not the ref's design, but perhaps the ref's interpretation. It ends up with things being put in boxes. And so we end up, for example, with the fact that you mentioned, this is a lot of what you've mentioned has been a very kind of UK context way of thinking, for now at least, about openness and books. But we have this current thinking from UKRI that they will be developing a long form outputs policy ahead of 2029, which in its essence seems quite broad, but firstly, it doesn't enable us to go now. And secondly, by saying long form does potentially capture quite a lot of things. So I'm kind of curious, I guess, putting these things together, these kind of the bigger, broader sense of what open monographs might be, and then the desire to get going now, which I personally tend to agree with, and then the pragmaticness of something like the UK research system that can be defined by the timescales of something like the REF, where we are hoping we'll get some policy ahead of 29. We don't know, but let's assume that we do. What do you think you've learned from things like COPIM, Open Books, about the things that policy's got to get right, and indeed doesn't and needs to avoid as well?
Yeah, I think I'm going to sound contradictory here, so bear with me, but I think it almost doesn't need to be too prescriptive. But I think the challenge there is that people in jobs like mine and this is where I've kind of got two hats on. I've got the kind of the Open Book Futures hat and the Gareth day job at Exeter hat. I think from the Open Book Futures kind of angle, I think there's a danger of kind of defining what open access is, and open access becoming a particular definition for long form publishing, or for journal publishing, or for A and other types of publishing. So I think if you keep that as kind of the definition of what you want as broad as possible, but then people like me will come in and go, well, what about this edge case? What about this case? What about this case? How do we do this? So I think there are a benefit almost of, Ref 29 onwards could almost say, books need to be open access. You decide what that means in your context, rather than saying it needs to be open access under a particular license, or it needs to be open access with an embargo within 12 months if it's kind of a repository or kind of green open access version. So I think I'm sure there would need to be, and people like me would insist, I think, kind of my day job hat, there would need to be kind of some sort of rules and kind of examples and whatever set in place, but I think not replicating a journal model of open access onto long form, onto monographs, I think is absolutely essential. I mean, those listening, and James yourself, who are actually kind of on the academic side in humanities disciplines and things, are probably far more in touch and far more aware of the kind of the challenges and the pressures that humanities particularly, but perhaps more generally, is maybe under pressure across the sector. And I think maybe having something that could be seen to have been a STEM thing in kind of open access with a particular license that works in certain disciplines but may not work in kind of humanities context. So maybe kind of the Creative Commons by attribution license, the CC BY license, where there's been a lot of debate in humanities as to the pros and cons of that. But I think having a policy that says we want things to be open, but actually you decide what that means for your particular context, I think could be a really interesting model going forward, personally speaking. I say it doesn't then have to be prescriptive, but it enables institutions, individual scholars, individual academics to actually go, this is what works for my book, or this is what works for my portfolio, or this is what works for my exhibition catalogue, or whatever it may be. I say keeping it simple, I think would be the best, not making it prescriptive. I think what I'd love Ref to do is, as they, to be fair, as they do, but maybe more so in the monograph world, would be kind of I'm simplifying the phrase, but kind of, we don't care where you publish, it's the quality of the work that's key. Again, kind of that wider hidden Ref ethos of all outputs are valid outputs. But again, I think in kind of the monograph world, I think really emphasizing that kind of the perceived prestige of particular publishers is not that important, perhaps. And again, I speak as a non-academic and non-scholar who doesn't have to go through the promotion hoops and routes that other people do. But monographs particularly sell so few copies nowadays in the great scheme of things, that actually does publishing with, and I won't name names to pick on the individual publishers, but does publishing with, I don't know, traditional prestige press A actually bring what an academic publishing with that press thinks it brings in terms of their career, in terms of everything else? And I think Ref really kind of doubling down on publish where you want, as long as it's open access, publish where you want. I think that would be a big thing for me. But I say not replicating kind of STEM models onto monographs, I think is the big thing, really. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble, but hopefully it makes sense. But yeah.
No, I think there's a logic to what you're saying, because I think one of the issues that many academics have had with the potential of having a journal style open access with license mandate imposed on books is that it feels like it intrudes on a sense of empowerment and choice. Like, for example, when you were saying that, maybe there could be a rule that says, you choose what forms of openness you think is appropriate for your work. I've had conversations with colleagues who said, well, if I publish sort of a long form piece of work through these particular outlets, I get these particular kinds of public outreach through my work. And that publisher I've chosen doesn't charge, 80, 90 quid for a book. It's a little bit cheaper and people might buy it, and there'll be book launch events. And does that constitute openness? And go back to the Morphs project, in some senses, some of that work would be, yes, that's openness, even though it does have a kind of a pound sign attached to it. I guess the challenge here becomes like, who pays for what at what point, right? So I could also imagine in your scenario of you choose the openness, you do an exhibition catalogue, which is a prestigious long form output, but somehow or other you give it away rather than sell it, right? You're giving it away to everyone who comes to exhibition. Well, okay, so that is open in some form, but someone's got to pay for that thing. At the moment, I guess we very much obsess when we think about books with the sort of the book processing charges, the dreaded PPCs, the sort of £10,000 or plus figure that's associated with them, and that being the form of openness that's become kind of quite quickly canonical. But that cannot be the only possible way of doing it, and there have to be alternatives to that, right, within a system for open monographs.
Oh, well and truly, I think I'm not, as you may well have gathered, I'm not a fan of kind of article processing charges or book processing charges, but I think they can play a role in the ecosystem as long as it's not the only like kind of funding model for books that are going forward. And I think a couple of the really interesting outcomes from kind of both COPIM and OBF Open Book Futures have been kind of a couple of different ways of funding kind of open access monographs for the presses that we're talking about. So you and others will probably be aware of kind of Opening the Future model that was kind of created as part of the project, or developed as part of the project. So kind of effectively libraries sign up and buy the backlist, so that the already published kind of closed access books in a traditional way as we would traditionally have bought, as libraries traditionally have bought content. But actually that money, rather than going towards something to do with the backlist, is actually used to open up the front list. So libraries are paying for kind of closed content, but with the future content being open access. So kind of that collective benefit of kind of the all books being open going forward. So I say that's kind of one model that the project's developed, and other publishers have, and I think that's running with about 3 or 4. They'll kill me for not having the exact number. It's about 3 or 4 publishers at the moment, and other kind of some of the larger kind of traditional publishers have. They're not quite the same schemes, but similar type schemes where libraries will pledge or will subscribe a certain amount of money, and then depending on how much of a target is reached, X number of books will be made open access by that publisher. So again, kind of breaking that link, direct link between an individual payment and a book being published, and kind of widen it up more to the community. So I'll say that open in the future, but also within the projects, Open Book Collective. So the Open Book Collective, where a number of the smaller presses that we're working with, a number of those presses kind of have come together, along with kind of infrastructure providers. And what the OBC, Open Book Collective, enables is libraries to effectively pay it's not even a subscription, one membership, one fee, one payment, but that payment can be split within the OBC to infrastructure providers, to the different presses. So again, you've got kind of that collective. You've almost got a collective on both sides. You've got a collective group of libraries who can subscribe independently and support the initiatives within the OBC, but you've also got that collective of initiatives within the OBC and they could be presses that libraries or universities wouldn't have supported individually, or may not even have heard of, with all due respect, individually as well. But because they've come together, because they're now part of the Open Book Collective, it's easier for people like me and in my day job and at Exeter and other kind of librarians and content and acquisition folk to support those open initiatives in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So again, the BPC has a role, hopefully a small one, in cost and in terms of percentage, but because you talked about 10k, I wish it was 10k. I mean, some of them are much more than that. Let's just say that. But I think actually having a mixture and a large number of different possible funding streams and different business models, having that kind of an active ecosystem of different models will work for different publishers, I think is the way, going back to if not now, when. I think that's what we've got to do. Those models exist. We just need to extend them further into different publishers. If funders are still willing to pay book processing charges, if Wellcome and UKRI are still willing to give money for BPCs, then let's still have BPCs. But for research that isn't funded by a funder that's willing to do that, or if Wellcome and UKRI in the future decide not to support kind of that type of payment in the future, let's really expand and let's really double down on those alternative methods as libraries and librarians. I say UK, but internationally as well. A lot of these initiatives have international support.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned things like Open Book Collective and the ways in which that's not just going into sort of funding publishers directly, but also infrastructure, because I think one of the things that Hidden Ref's talked about quite a lot is the way in which the kind of infrastructures around things like the journal article, like the journal in itself, has created a sort of, a dominance of that format because of the way it can be fitted into all sorts of other systems of things like metrics, et cetera, discovery and that kind of stuff. And I guess it's fair to say that one of the things that the open movement and the kind of the managerialization maybe of the journal article has created a situation in which the other forms of output are not as easily discoverable. They're not as connected through infrastructures in the ways in which they used to be. And whilst we often in Hidden Ref think about the exhibition, the patent, the data set, whatever it might be, and the kind of infrastructures for those, the infrastructures for books have also kind of suffered to some extent as well. You started out by saying that, putting DOIs on chapters of books, which in and of itself seems like a bit of a weird hack for a book to make it work, but we've kind of forced our way into that position, right? We're sort of in a place where the infrastructures aren't quite right for books as well as for, other forms of less traditional outputs for research.
Yeah, I may be a bit more optimistic than that.
I guess we have ISBNs, right? You know,
Yeah,
they've been around a while.
But they're not unique. So let's not go.
No,
there.
I know.
But I think I get what you're saying. But I think actually, if you think of kind of some of the infrastructures that exist, if I can call kind of DOAB, so the Directory of Open Access Books, OAPEN, in terms of kind of the discoverability of open monographs and open content, I think libraries and librarians have been kind of advocating and directing kind of advocating and communicating that they exist in training sessions for a while. I think there's to an extent there's a matter of scale. I mean, there are more journal articles than books. Will books, and same with patents and data sets, etc. Do books get lost in library catalogues to an extent because of kind of the dominant model of journal publishing and the challenge of book reviews appearing in library catalogues when you're searching for the book and things like that? But I think actually, in terms of infrastructures, I think there are open infrastructures. There are, as I've talked about DOAB and OAPEN, there's kind of the repository infrastructure as well, which can be used for books. There's a separate conversation around repositories and books, I think, which going forward. But I don't think that open books, maybe I'm just naive, maybe I'm in a different world, but I don't think that kind of open books are as hidden as any other book. I just think there's fewer of them. So I don't think it's hidden. I think it's scale. And I think when there are more open books, they will be more visible and people will realize they are there. I think there is, I think there is that little bit of, if you've got one of something against 100, the one's going to get lost. As soon as you get 20 of something against 100, it becomes more visible. It becomes more accessible. It becomes more noticed. And I think that's probably the challenge we've got in terms of raising the number of open access books to make sure that they are captured within the various ecosystems correctly. I think I made a slight joke, but alluded to it kind of around the ISBNs not being unique. And obviously you mentioned the fact that me and Rupert met over discussing kind of DOIs for book chapters. I think one of the challenges is kind of the wider metadata ecosystem as well. And we can talk about open books, but what about open metadata? How do libraries, which may have been kind of where you were going, I suppose, in your question, but kind of how do open books end up in library catalogues? How do open books end up in I don't know, on Google Scholar or whatever it may be, or in JSTOR or Google Books, etc. Lots of other aggregators exist. Again, sorry to go back to the project, but one of the other kind of work packages on the project has developed and created and launched Totes Open Metadata, which is deliberately designed to help these publishers that we're working with, but also to enable, where possible, kind of that open access metadata, so effectively CC0 metadata, but that metadata about those open access books to be easily sent to the places where people go to get their books, whether that be JSTOR, whether it be Project Muse, whether it be Google Books, etc. So again, publishers that are part of Tote will has an inbuilt metadata schema. It then creates those. It can then create metadata in different formats and in different schemas, which it then pings off to those different aggregators. So again, it's part of that wider ecosystem that I think the project has, or the project, sorry, have helped to build. But I think that kind of that discovery, that dissemination has been integral to what the projects are doing. And as I say, I'm maybe not quite as negative as your question implied when it comes, but maybe I'm just in it too close and I don't see it from the outside. But I think I think open book. I mean, just take Exeter where I work now. Open access books are in our library catalogue. We have a kind of a proprietary service, but those open access books still appear in that catalogue without us having to subscribe to get those open access books. So I think we're getting there. Can we go further? Yes. But I think we should not forget, going back to what I was talking about, kind of where we were 10 years ago. We're a lot further advanced than where we were.
No, I agree. And I think one of the curious things maybe around sort of discovery systems and libraries more generally is that maybe if you spoke to a librarian 50 years ago and said, what is the key unit around which your discovery is organized, it'll be the book. And that's probably not true anymore. And I guess that's the kind of the heart of my point, which is that books have become a sort of whether it's an open book or a non-open book, or the various different forms of open you explained we possibly could have within books, they kind of they're now part of the anomalies within the system as opposed to being part of the centrality of that system of discovery. And things like, research incentives through things like REF have driven us maybe towards that kind of world where the journal article is sort of is king ultimately within how we think about discovery and how we think about our systems. If I could bring us back to squarely to hidden ref, maybe as a way of kind of as closing this off, because this has been really interesting and I think really relevant to what we talk about. I also think it's important because what the kind of work you're doing is campaigning for is sort of to say, well, books should be part of the future of research. And if the future of research is something where we all broadly agree that publicly funded research is made open in some form, then we've got to solve the problem for books. And yet, as we started with, this is very much an unsolved problem. What Hidden Ref is trying to do, I guess, fundamentally in its work, is to highlight where there are disadvantages created by systems by the ref, or indeed probably disadvantages created by interpretations of structures like the ref, and that particular people or particular outputs, particular communities, particular ways of working and doing research are disadvantaged. And it feels like we might be in a position where a lack of an open access mandate is sort of starting to create a kind of structural bias away from certain researchers, arts, humanities, social science in particular. What would fixing that look like? Where do we get to the point where people in those disciplines can feel as though they are full participants in a system that might feel like it's working against them at the moment? What does your community think? Should be the future ultimately here? And I guess I should say, your community in COPIM is not laser focused on the ref and research assessment systems like we are, but they must be one of your kind of constant sort of secondary background considerations.
Yeah, and one thing I should have mentioned when we were going through the projects, actually, the projects were funded by Arcadia and Research England as well. So, although obviously nothing to do with REF, but kind of just to flag that we did get money from Research England. Yes, I think, I mean, there's a wider conversation around double weighting, triple weighting, quadruple weighting books, and the potential, which is not an open access question, that's just a book question. Is a 100,000 word monograph really only worth 2 of a 8,000 word journal article? I think is an interesting discussion to have. But also, I think, I take the essence, not having books as part of kind of the open access policy, and almost, in fact, not even not having them explicitly saying they're not in, unlike some of the other outputs that Hidden Ref kind of campaigns for. At least they haven't said, software isn't explicitly in the open access policy, unlike books. It's kind of, well, why is a book different? But I think, having that policy, I think would do 2 things. It would begin to equalize, as you say, kind of books with journal articles. They are effectively, I'm massively simplifying, but they are effectively both textual outputs. One's just longer than the other. There's obviously much more complicated between them. But also, I think having that mandate would actually force institutions like mine to do something about open access books, and to think seriously about open access books rather than to say, that's a problem for tomorrow, or that's a problem for the future. So if kind of the ref team in tomorrow turned around and said, actually, from the 1st of January 2029, rather than just saying that's our ambition, actually we're going to say, yes, anything published after that is going to have to be open access, then that would really, I think it would panic quite a few institutions and quite a few academics, but I think it would force us to confront the challenges that we're facing, and it would actually force us to to think about how much support we give to books over journal articles, how much support we give to, and as you say, books tend to be focused in humanities, social science, and arts. They tend to be focused in kind of that subset of an institution, and I think actually it would begin to hopefully it wouldn't go the other way, but hopefully it begins to kind of raise the profile of kind of the work that's done in those disciplines, increasing the visibility of the work that's done in those disciplines. If we say that publishing open access, well, not if we say, and there's loads of evidence, and I think it's probably proved now, that publishing open access increases dissemination, increases visibility, it increases kind of the academic impact, if not the society, the ref impact, at least the academic impact of your work. Why aren't we supporting that in humanities disciplines who are publishing books? If genuinely we think open access is a good thing, why aren't we actually just saying to all of our humanities researchers and other researchers, sorry, that's the historian in me, everything's humanities. If we just say to all the researchers who are publishing books, actually, yeah, we're going to support you publishing OA, but effectively under these terms, because this is what we're going to support as an institution. That would change the picture overnight, I think. So having some sort of mandate, I think will be challenging, but I think it would force us to do things that we're currently not forced to do as institutions in this area. And I think the work that we've done on COPIM, the work that the work that's been done on COPIM, the work that's been done on Open Futures shows there is an open future for monographs. We just need, as universities in the UK and elsewhere, to actually take that and show that future is sustainable and that future is a good thing for monographs, which it is.
And we're already in 2026. 2029
Exactly.
is actually not far away in research terms, particularly in monograph development terms. Yeah. It's already creating uncertainty in terms of people planning for their careers and around the research assessment exercises, which people inevitably do. It shouldn't be, and in most cases isn't the forefront of their minds, but is creating uncertainty. And I think I agree with you that we need some certainty soon. If you were a betting man, would you say that there is going to be a mandate? Yes or no?
Yes. I think it's 60-40, but yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. That's a great place to end. Thanks so much, Gareth. And thank you for joining us on the What the Ref podcast.
Well, that was fantastic. It was really interesting to hear that issue around open publishing of books, because obviously for me, and I know this is a bit naive because I'm not within the publishing of books area, but when I think open access, I just think open access of journal publications. So I am very guilty of that. But the thing that really struck me during that interview was when he started talking about, trying to put boundaries on what an open publishing of a book actually means. Then we started talking about licenses, and then even, you start worrying when people say, well, actually, what do you mean by book? They think, well, is there nothing that was defined in this world? But I've always found this issue whenever we're trying to change the way that a culture is occurring around something, not just in academia, but in the world, you have to define what you're working on. And I saw this with my work with research software engineers when people wanted me to say, well, what do you mean by a research software engineer? And I always lived without a boundary, because I was kind of, as soon as you create that boundary, you, by definition, create a group that isn't in it. So you're going to not be representative of the entire problem space anymore. Not that there's a major problem with drawing boundaries, but there is a problem with drawing boundaries too early when you're trying to solve a problem. So I'm just, that really struck home for me.
If I could put on my historian hat briefly, it reminds me of the historian of science, Adrian Johns, said that in order to understand the historic book, we need to forget what we think we know about the book. And it's a way of framing a problem, which is to say well, it goes also to things like heuristics, and we talked about at the Hidden Ref Festival, right? You bring each individual brings a lot of things to their understanding of a word like book. And once you start unpacking it, you start to realize that, maybe there is a normative assumption about what that is. And I'm not going to sit here and say the book doesn't exist, because that would be utterly daft, right? But ultimately, we definitely can see from Gareth's interview that the process of thinking about openness within long form, he also didn't like the word long form, right? But the process of thinking about openness in that space has led to a thinking of, well, what is this thing we're trying to open up anyway? And I think that's what's really interesting about the interview, that kind of, well, if we don't quite know what we're opening up and there's multiplicity of forms of them, then maybe we need to fix the type of openness to the type of output rather than kind of have a top-down assumption of what openness should be for this category.
What did you think about the practical solution he had, which was just kind of, we'll just work with it. We'll say you have to do open access of some form with something that we're going to call a book for now, and we'll just allow people to muddle through. Like, I saw that as being quite practical in one sense, but I also saw it as being very open to manipulation by people who don't want to be open and don't want to publish a book.
Well, this is really interesting because it reminds me of what we're doing with NTO guidance a little bit, and this structure versus agency tension of, when you look at the ref, it typically is quite prescriptive and it tells you exactly what it wants. But there are some pockets of like freedom and agency that the ref is giving the community, and NTO guidance, although we've got Annex K and we can look at it, we can see that there is a lot of ambiguity within that guidance. And so maybe it is great for the people producing research, but it's not so great for ref managers and HEIs who are trying to fit into the submission. And I think they are craving structure here. They don't want that agency and freedom. And they actually, so what we've heard from the workshops we've been running, they're creating their own structure in the form of templates, which then they embellish with the ref logos. And so they create that, I guess, to de-risk NTO submission, to create some kind of standardization around that and consistency, which then becomes embedded in the system. And it creates that folk knowledge where then people are actually not sure whether this comes officially from the ref or is this something that we've created. So I think the tension between what the researchers and the community want and what the ref managers and HEIs from the governance point of view want can be very different, and how we balance this tension is very interesting for us in the open access world, but also in the NTO guidance world.
I have to say that for one thing, you've just trailed down a new segment, which is coming. We'll talk about later about ref folklore, which I think is a really exciting thing to get into. But I have this idea of the ref being quite, prescriptive. Actually, I think, when you first look at the guidelines, it feels that way. But actually, when you get into it, it's so open, as you were pointed out. So at the workshop in Plymouth a couple of days ago, somebody said, what's the definition of a design? Because they were all worked on designs. And so I got the definition up, and it was like, it could be an architectural design, or it could be design of an item, or it could be design of, it's like a cereal packet, or, a plant pot. It was just like, it just kept going on, all these different designs. And they were like, so just anything then. And I was like, basically that's the guidelines that we've got.
I mean, for me, the thing about the guidelines here is that we've got on one hand open access, which is a kind of global international movement thinking about the kind of value and purpose of making scholarship open. And then we've got REF, which would like to have open access within it to kind of ensure that kind of progression of openness happens. But to Ola's point, people who respond to the REF require structure. So on the point about open for books then, I think the point Gareth's making and the community is making about fit the openness to the type of work makes a huge amount of sense. Give people freedom to do the right kinds of openness and support them in doing that makes sense if you're just thinking about getting scholarship out there. But if you're thinking of fitting it within the system of a particular research assessment framework conducted by one country, the UK, then it doesn't make a great deal of sense, right? Because it will end up with a kind of daft situation where the guidelines are too open and universities don't know how to interpret them. The other thing to say on books, of course, would be that books, we've been through lots of rounds of consultations about this in the UK around openness and books. And we've ended up in the situation where we keep kicking the can down the road because that's felt like the only viable thing to do. And maybe actually having a less prescriptive approach might break the deadlock effectively around this problem, which is that we could do with a better form of openness around books, but we shouldn't be doing it just because the journal-based system in which we operate is sort of imposing that upon books. And I think one of the things you were interested about this interview, Simon, was just not, as you said at the beginning, not really thinking about the fact that journals dominate, right? And there are, within the wider system, books are probably now NTOs. Like, they're not in most subject areas in the humanities and social sciences, but in the wider system, they're kind of not traditionally submitted.
I was really fascinated by that, especially as later on in the interview you were talking about, kind of how books are kind of almost being pushed out. And again, I know it's naive, but it's that situation. When I got into academia, I did expect, people sitting around in book-lined offices, smoking pipes and discussing things, well, yes, okay. This is a good point. You're still holding on to that one, James. And this is my home, so this is not an office. But that was the concept, so, and you would work on these, I don't know what the problem with long form is, because I'm also not in that debate, but these big outputs that would, cover a large part of your life and thinking, and that's what academia was all about. And actually, no, it's been pushed the direction of journal outputs, journal publications coming out as quickly as possible. In physics, journal publications are the thing, but what about in your own fields? I mean, is there still prominence for books? Surely for James, but Ola, what about you?
I just wanted to ask you, do you think it's because there's no time to read books now in academia when you're a researcher, or you've got teaching, you've got management, you've got administration? What do you think? Maybe there's no time for this.
Well, we talked about slow academia the other week, and I don't think it is necessarily about no time for it. I think, within the subject areas I know best, like history, the book is still a fundamental currency of a career, and a good book even more so. I think my point is more, I guess, that books are they're like really emotional objects within subject areas, and they're incredibly important. And yet at the same time, they don't seem to fit the system of how we want research to be produced. If we just abstract from the type of output, which I guess is what Hidden Rep is all about, and think about what it is we want people to do. We want people to be producing great research. We want to be accessible to many different types of people. And the form of the book doesn't really allow that in ways that we would like sometimes. And equally, the systems of discovery we built around journal articles dominated by the STEM subjects don't allow that same kind of discoverability of books. The classic example here is, I think Gareth mentioned it, is that when you set a student off to kind of find a book in the library catalogue, they find the reviews. Right. Yeah. And that's a thing that everybody knows who is in a book subject area. Is like students come back with the reviews, and they eventually will find the book. But that's the library catalogue has been structured around this article thing, which diminishes the kind of the prominence of the actual primary output in some cases, because of the way that kind of journals are wonderful to index, and they're wonderful to kind of get through discovery systems in ways that books really aren't.
That's fascinating. So that's new. That's news to me. I wasn't aware that so the way to get forward in these subject areas is to write reviews of books, not to write books themselves. Is that right?
I don't think that's quite true, but I think
they're much easier to find, aren't they?
You definitely want your book to be reviewed lots of times by lots of journals, because then it'll be easy to discover in a library system. Yeah.
I have to, and this point on reading, I think is really interesting again. So one of the things I love about working in the Hidden Ref area is that we have such different disciplinary backgrounds. And one of the discussions I was having with Gemma the other day was, we were talking about how we could do a review of what I saw as a very large corpus of reading material, which was 1,500 different NDOs. And I was kind of like, we'll need a machine learning algorithm, natural language processing. And she was we'll just read them. And I was like, well, why would I'm not reading 1,500 things. If it's more than 3, we write software to do the job for us, And that was seen as being the wrong approach. So that's part of the joy.
Exciting news. We've got another feature on our podcast called the Folklore Corner.
So where did this come from?
Well, it's actually been inspired by the NTO workshops we've been running, and the stuff that we've been hearing from participants coming and telling us stuff that we didn't know, that we couldn't verify on the spot, that they couldn't tell us where this information is coming from. So there's a lot of misconception and many myths out there which we'd like to bring to you and contest.
So I thought it was really interesting. So it was one of the previous NTO workshops where there was a discussion around what could be submitted, and there was real vehemence about what how the rules should be interpreted. But we've seen it on various different with interactions with various different groups. And I like this sort of cargo cult type approach there is around some of these areas where it's kind of like, we did this last time and it worked, so it must be the right interpretation. And then some of the folklore is kind of just, it's handed down from ref generation to ref generation. And it's like, well, the person who trained me told me that this is the right thing to do. And it's not actually, sometimes it's not actually true, sometimes it is. So I think this idea of like, we can focus on some of this folklore and try and find the evidential basis for it and discuss that is really interesting.
So we've been collecting them, based on the ones we've heard. We've spun the wheel, and this time we've come up with trade books and novels can't be submitted to the ref.
Which is
something I hear. Yeah, I know. It's helpful, right? Yeah, it's something I hear occasionally. And it's one of those ones that I hear it and then it often gets corrected almost immediately, but it still seems to be somewhere in the system. I think there's two parts to it. The novels bit is, I think, often from, shall we say, other disciplinary areas maybe not realizing that creative practice works like novels and poems do get submitted and anthologies.
Maybe panel A and B are particularly surprised.
Yeah, but the trade book one is a kind of it's a kind of blurry area, because actually, if you look through some of the guidance around, again, open access, ref, and things, there are some sort of distinctions sometimes made about, you know, things that are explicitly made for kind of trade publications are not necessarily things that we see as fitting the criteria of excellence within the ref. However, it is one of those that, like, if the book is based on original and sustained research and it just so happens to be published through what we might see as a trade book route, then of course it's eligible because it's research.
Well, that was a straightforward answer. I was expecting, levels of nuance, but no, it is actually eligible. Okay. So, I mean, is this something you come across a lot? I mean, it's a new area to me. This folklore.
Yeah, well, I think it's one that's born out of this sense that there is a distinction between some forms of books and monographs. And of course, like in the Hidden Ref, we do say journal articles and books, but really what we tend to mean is journal articles and monographs, because there are different, to go back to the previous conversation, there are different forms of books, right? There are kind of books that are used principally for teaching purposes, there are textbooks, and there are other forms of books, right? And there is a bit of a blurry area. And I think one of the challenges for some scholars who work in the kind of arts, humanities and social sciences who are in more kind of book-oriented disciplines is that they want to produce work that does have some kind of impact with people, obviously reading it and having some kind of wider readership beyond just academia. And that is where their traditions come from in terms of book publishing. But some of the book publishing structures are pushing towards a sort of a slightly narrower conception of what a book might be, is the point. So it is a myth, effectively, but there are certain forms of things it's like, it's one of those that you can tell it when you look at it kind of things, right? There are certain types of things you look at and go, that's not going to be refable. But there are certain types of books which clearly are, and some which sort of might blur between the boundaries, but ultimately they're based on that quality research, then it's fine.
And it probably is also informed, or maybe shaped rather than informed, by how an output is valued within a discipline. So, for example, me coming from the business and management background, I've got it written down here. Out of 16,000 outputs in the Ref 2021, only 302 were books or chapters, which make them an NTO. So business and management, journal articles reign supreme. They can be nonetheless submitted, they're allowed, but I don't think they're valued as much. I think maybe management literature is more about, the kind of self-help, how to make $1 million kind of thing. But it doesn't filter through to management practitioners as well. And I think maybe they're seeking a quick read, a quick digest as well. And I don't know what the popularity of books for, reaching that wider audience is doing in business and management.
And this is where I think we've moved from kind of like folklore into sort of rules of thumb and value. Like I certainly would suggest in areas I know better that, a good monograph with a good publisher is going to be something that may well be double weighted. A chapter in a book, people sort of like, the rule of thumb might be we need to just double check if this is good or not, because they tend to not be peer reviewed, for example, at the level of the individual chapter. Whilst this, of course, many books are not also fully peer reviewed, and then some sort of are, and it's all very complicated. So we're in a space where it's like there are reasons why a folklore like a trade book can't be submitted exist, because there's an imagination. It sits within a different kind of structure of evaluation, maybe, in the same way there's imagined a different structure of evaluation with a chapter for a book in most cases.
So as we've moved from ref folklore to ref rules of thumb, should we maybe wrap this up and talk about? I mean, so with the folklore idea, we're going to be out there collecting folklore ourselves, but also we'd love people to send in their, I've heard this, is it true or not? You can email us on wtref@hidden-ref.org. I think that'd be a really interesting new segment for the podcast to answer some of these questions.
And maybe we'll get a jingle later.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Ola. Thanks, Simon. And thanks to Gareth, our guest on this episode. Please tune in for a future episode of What the Ref. You can get us in all the usual places, YouTube, Acast, etc., wherever you get your podcasts. Simon's already mentioned the email address, but I'll mention it again, wtref@hidden-ref.org. And yeah, join us again next time for another episode of What the Ref.
Goodbye.
Bye.